So, hello guys. Today we are going to actually dwell on the thread that I made over the rand way forward for Ukraine, based on what the Russians supposedly have lost, what they can manufacture, and what they can spare. Um, on top of it, we are going to discuss about something that is extremely worrying for Ukraine right now, and that is going in the complete other way uh, that I thought. I really thought that the Ukrainians were going to stall as much as possible in Avdiivka, and they were going to stall as much as possible uh, around Pobieda, around Ugledar, around Novomihailovka. One special part of the space would be also covering the fact that so far the Russians have shown extreme discipline when it comes to informational security. So InfoSec was extremely tight. Most of the advances so far have been shown not by the Russians, except for Novomihailovka, when we clearly saw footage from the 155th, actually giving the counterpart of two videos that the goons from the ZSU showed with the so-called destroyed material just in front of the eastern entry of the city or the village, call it as you wish. It was shown that in fact that equipment, while damaged, had been left behind, and the Marines advanced in the city, capturing between 15 and 20% so far. The biggest surprise was that Rand and people who actually penned that article for Rand went on this exact same tangent they have been going for now 2 years. Um, my first reaction to the article was to say that people who believe Jack Watling 2 years after he failed on almost every front, and doesn't mean that everything is positive for Russia, but he failed on absolutely every front. So basically, the capability of the Russian forces to sustain themselves, the reserve situation, on that he wasn't alone. Like, in course, most of the Western commentators had said that the Russians didn't have the capability to sustain the losses and to make up for whatever was being thrown at them. Some big troubles that we saw when it came to the Russians themselves was also that nobody tried to understand the main problem. Main problem of the Russians all along 2023 was that reorganization and a complete change in posture was happening. Part of it was, as I said, the reorientation of the defense dispositive, which was mostly oriented towards the Donetsk oblast and the Kharkov oblast, with the departure from Kherson, northern Kherson. As you guys remember, the trenches for the so-called Surovikin line were started to be built, and it gave a very pleasant surprise for us, to the Ukrainians, initially when they tried to probe in March, and then from June onwards. The Zaporizhia front needs to be spoken about because the Russians themselves reduced the pressure on the front. There are small advances around Robotyne, but we do not see big pushes. Most of the pushes that we're seeing right now are small infantry groups with one or two vehicles trying to push forward, get trench after trench, and try to get inside the city within, I think, the month of March. It's very lackluster, let's say it like this, but in absolute terms, it's completely normal. because the Zaporozhye front has for the moment ceased to be interesting for the Russians. It's true it shouldn't be like this because it stays the salient of roughly 70 square kilometers. It is a perfect kill zone, but it gives them, if they have stupid ideas and they can manage to shift the balance of forces and try to get this time a lot more focused, it might give some small surprises, albeit it's not that important right now because it would need a front-wide push. As we saw with the Russians, the only way to sustain this kind of silence need its pressure all over the front, so you can stretch your adversary. This is the main problem that the Rand article wasn't recognizing for the whole 2023. Russia, although for 5 months wasn't having the initiative, they were still for the rest of the year 2023 always in charge of the pace of the battle. Of course, there were losses. I already discussed this. But the most important part is that the Rand article um, refuses to recognize critical and fundamental changes in the Russian way of war, which are qualitatively superior on the tactical level, but on the overall goal, do not change that much the main problem of the Russian military right now, which is um, they do not want to commit the same kind of effort that they committed the first 3 months of the war, which is a huge front line, huge expenditure. And of course, the problem with that is, as I already said, if you do that with not enough people, you are going to lose everywhere. If you then start focusing on the places you actually care for and want to hold, then you arrive at the situation that we have with the Russians post May 2022, where what it was important for them was holding Kherson and holding parts of Zaporizhia and, of course, the Luganda and Zimbabwe oblasts, which basically allowed them to have the land bridge, which basically allowed them also to have a internal transfer of goods by ship in the Sea of Azov, which allows them, of course, to bypass, if they want, both the outer ring of the Crimean Peninsula, but also to avoid using the main bridge on Kerch. So on that aspect, the recent loss of the Cesar Kunikov uh, once again is puzzling, but probably Cesar Kunikov was not going for Crimea, was probably going to drop some goods and then depart for Syria. This, of course, in my opinion, is stupid for Syria. It needs to be other solution, probably with a civilian ship or civilian ships, and of course the aviation. Given that the Ukrainians, it doesn't matter if the ship concerns or not the war in Russia, every military ship now on the Russian side is game. Biggest problem, I'm not going to speak about the ship itself because I mean that needs a completely different space, one that would be a lot more sober for that. And but mainly the biggest problem for the Russian Navy right now is that they cannot have a counterpart to hit against. So as I said, it's a bit like fighting against FPVs when you're in a tank. The other side will just send more. So escorts and passive defenses are only going to be that much useful. The difference is that given that they have the transmission, so basically the guidance capabilities offered by Starlink, that by the way they bypass, they chip them, they alter them in order to use Starlink on movement. Because if you people know a little bit about Starlink, in order to receive, you need to stay steady, and as we can see, that's not the case with the Starlinks employed for the Magura or the Sea Baby or whatever. On that part, I'm saying I'm gonna wait until Avdiivka is wrapped, and then we're gonna probably do a space over the biggest issues. And I would like to call in our Greek friend TT125 for a more detailed view on what he thinks could work when it comes to GPS spoofing. On the mechanical and passive part, I always said to people from TWK, either you have side ships as protections, so basically as ballasts. Those would be either chained, either attached in a way or another to the ship hull. Either you have floating pontoons thick enough to stop these boats. And despite the fact that they would add more drag in both cases to the ships, the only thing that's going to happen at that moment is, just as I said, the Ukrainians are going to send more and more and more and more drones like this in order to bypass all the passive defenses. This, as I said, should allow, by having those passive defenses, should allow the personnel on board with machine guns or small autocannons to take them out. Another possibility, as I said, once again, is using UCAVs like the Orion. However, that would mean that for an attack like happened to the Kunikov or to the Ivanovets, you would have to fly at least 2 drones, even 3, given that most Russian drones are now maximally armed with 4 ammunition. So every single part of it, when it comes to purely defensive aspects, will not help in the long run because, as I said, these small crappy things that are floating cost to the Ukrainians a lot less than the targets that they take out. So the only point is to force those boats to pay a certain price, not by being destroyed, by simply using the same kind of boats to deprive Ukraine from exporting grain and to put the few assets that they have on their literal coast guard in actually another capacity. So basically to start and hunt these small baby drones and of course take out whatever is left of the Ukrainian fleet and disrupt the basically the shipping passages from the Odessa corridor towards Sulina in Romania and down to the Bosphorus. This, of course, opens the danger of unrestricted naval warfare. This already existed because they attacked the oiler Graf. The Ukrainians did that. So, in general, it's going to get worse on the Black Sea, but the only way to make Romanians, Bulgarians, and Turks that shit is not going to fly is to start stopping the shipping. The Ukrainians, they don't care, to be honest, because when there was a shipping lane, a grain deal agreed between Russia and Ukraine, they still used the lane to move up the drones initially, and they attacked by the same logic the Crimean Bridge. So on that aspect, for the Ukrainians, everything that you give them is something they took from you. There is no compromise. And on that aspect, once again, there needs to be a price paid in human lives, in state interests, in costs overall, be that pecuniary cost, so material cost, or human cost, in any kind of way. The only problem that those drones have now for Russia is that they need to have a toll for the operation. And right now, they do not have a large enough toll. Whatever is attacked in the port of Odessa, in Reni, it doesn't really matter. For the Ukrainians, they know that every single grain exported is already something completely out of the normal. They weren't counting on it. What they were counting, though, is when they start making their accounts, they start seeing the losses on long term, then they start being more vocal. That's what happened when they were crying to Turkey for the grain deal. If every single part of the shipping is stopped, even though they're going to start inflicting losses on maritime shipping outside of Russia, what they are going to do is simply equal the problems that they have. For the Russian having those problems, not it's supportable for a couple of I'd say months. For Ukraine, it's not supportable to have its grain rot. Therefore, I think there needs to be something over there, or force Ukraine to go by land. If they go by land, it's going to slow a lot of the traffic is going to put a lot more trains on the rail, a lot of more trucks on the road, and you can start attacking and clogging the railroad from southern Ukraine towards Romania, towards Hungary, and towards, of course, Poland. So all these small things need to be done, but it's not the goal of the space today. The goal of the space today is once again to go back to what Rand is keeping as a mantra for 2 years now, and this was started by that Estonian intelligence report, who was saying that the Ukrainians need to kill a certain amount of Russians in order to stop the Russians from having a force regeneration, and this for them was between 50 and 80,000 people that need to be killed per half a year. The problem with 50 to 80,000 people to be killed for half a year was based on the fact that every half a year the Russians were recruiting 130,000 people. So basically, every step of recruitment was about 260,000 people for Russia, and the point to reduce that ability was to cause 50,000 dead or irrecoverable losses as a minimum per half a year. So basically, take out the basic level of over 30% in order to render the units combat ineffective. This is, of course, a problem because it wasn't already not grounded in the reality. The reality was that if Russia picks up normally, so we are speaking just volunteers, 260,000, Ukraine is having problems having that amount per year by literally requisitioning people. And the whole point for Ukraine with a supposed 500,000 mobilization that wouldn't be able to happen at once is exactly to put its level of recruitment at the same level as Russia. But once again, we explained what the problem was with the military recruitment on the Ukrainian side. Given the state of its economy, given the state of its supply typology, so basically they receive most of their supplies from abroad. What they spend on their own money is not enough, and adding a full mobilization cycle of 450 or 500,000, you would get to between 13 and 15 billion dollars just to have these guys stand up with some guns per year. I made a small calculus. I said that the mobilization would cost about $27,000 to $35,000 per year per person mobilized without the equipment that goes with it. Which means that once you do the analysis, on the cheapest side, it's about 600 euros per person per day, and on the most expensive side, you are roughly 1,000, more or less, per person per day. That issue, though, has a complete different logic when you are discussing how much you need to actually pay extra for the equipment, for the oil, etc. So literally, just the individual cost for one person was going to be 13 billion, but the maintenance, the fuel, the equipment, the ammunition, and so on, if you start adding the cost that the EU is paying, for instance, for 200,000 artillery shells, they were supposed to have been paying about how was it? I think it was 4,000 a shell, so you're at over 800 million, something like that. Generally, the cost for the supplies and the sustainment of your troops, of food and so on, makes the initial 13 billion absolutely useless. It's going to be a one-time disbursement. On top of it, as I said, you are going to take out 500,000 for sure out of your tax pool, but you're going to start giving them money in order for them to fight and paying for everything they're going to have. Of course, in real life, it doesn't work like that. Ukrainian soldiers pay a lot from their pockets just to stay alive on the trenches. On the Russian side, there is the same trend. But the most problematic thing is that while individual and PPE equipment um, is being mostly paid by the soldiers themselves, the purchase power of the Ukrainian soldier and the purchase powers of the Russian soldier are completely two different worlds. First of all, because of one side having more people, so if those people contribute the exact same thing, so let's say 10 million Russians contribute 10 euros, and uh, 10 million Ukrainians contribute 10 euros, what it takes from both sides as a cost is completely different. For the Russian, with the current economy and so on, 10 euros are going to represent a rather small amount of its monthly income. For the Ukrainians, first of all, it's going to be more. But then the scaling up is going to be more complicated. Those 10 million Ukrainians, they cannot get to 20 because the market, the labor market in Ukraine is between roughly now between 10 and 14 million with informal jobs and so on. On the Russian side, the market is roughly about 72 to 74 million people. So you can scale up to 30 million by pushing, I don't know, bonds or whatever. There you have already a problem when it comes to simply the volunteer networking. And therefore, the cost of doing business for both sides is extremely important, because on the Ukrainian side, a lot of what they're buying is extremely expensive, given that they are turning towards Germany, towards Spain, and so on. There are also problems where donations are sold and so on. For other aspects, of course, they go to China like everybody else. But given that they do not have the scalability of the, I'd say, credit value of the what they can have as money from their, I'd say, contribution pool, they are going to have a lot more problems into buying whole ranges of productions. When Ukrainians are complaining that Russians go to China and buy a whole line of production, it's not wrong. It's maybe a little bit exaggerated, but the reality is that volunteer groups in Russia are able to do that, just that. On the Ukrainian side, what happens most of the time is that the money that's pooled together is not buying finished products most of the time. They are doing part of this assembly, refinement, and analysis at home. This happens also on the Russian side. But on the Russian side, we have seen a full-on product just being brought in. This is a gain of time and a gain of, I'd say, trust with the Chinese manufacturers. On the Korean side, buying subcomponents, first of all, costs cheaper, but most of the problem with just buying subcomponents and producing at home is that the money for that home production stays in Ukraine for sure, but it's a double contribution. So you're gonna pull together 10 million to buy in China, and you're gonna have people at home being paid also to make your drones. The difference between the two aspects is that on one side, capital, on the Russian side, frees up manpower in Russia itself. Of course, there are groups that are also mounting FPVs. That's not the problem here. The problem is that the idea itself of investing at home for Ukraine, recycling the money, is interesting if they had the whole chain of production at home. They don't. So they bleed money to China, and then they bleed their own money on a recycling scheme. So basically, the government is going to buy from volunteer groups or private enterprises, which is what Zaluzhny was saying, that there was a typical concern system that was being established in Ukraine within the government. So basically, government officials and people close to Yermak, to Zelensky, and so on, were actually hoarding orders for FPVs, for equipment, and so on. But this is what exactly is causing the problem. Um, Given that you do not control the sourcing of most of it, you're just manufacturing them, assembling them, you are having a double loss. Money that is paid to buy Chinese drones goes to China, that's one part, but then someone else needs to pay to assemble them. And if there is no money for the assembly, so you spare on the money, you are taking time from your volunteers that could have done something else for you. And given that they are assembling the drones at home, they cannot be at the front at the same time. So the problem when you have a smaller manpower and you have a smaller wallet is that indeed you can do a lot of things at home and have this logic of self-development, but most of the parts are coming from China, and you are using them to send to the Russians. In a certain aspect, and the Russians do the same, by the way, you are just doing the R&D for the Russians themselves. Once the Russians are going to see what happens with this, so in terms of networking, in terms of frequencies, in terms of the equipment you're going to start buying. Initially, it was the contrary. When first the Russians introduced the thermal cameras, the CD, CX6 and so on, the Ukrainians started to say, oh my God, it costs that much. But when they started to buy it for themselves, and I have the case when they started with good quality matrices, and then they went to cheaper Chinese because they wanted to reduce the price. But that's the problem. You are showing your R&D to the enemy, because not every FPV works properly, and a lot of FPVs actually are not like rocket science anymore. Literally, the other side knows also what you're buying, because sometimes you are buying from the same spot, from traders, from wholesalers, from also producers. So at some point, when, for instance, a Ukrainian group goes and complains that, I don't know, Blue Sky doesn't have engines anymore for brushless engines for drones and stuff like that, who the fuck did buy them? If they're not in Ukraine, they're probably in Russia, and that's how Blue Sky's brushless engines have been started to replace the AX from Czechia. So for Ukraine, a lot of the problems are not simply attracting Russia; it's also managing its own cost. Because we are at the point when initially it was fun. A FPV was like $400, and then you would have a RPG warhead that most of the time was bought with foreign money. You would fuse it up, add $100 big maximum, and for $500 you would have a guided artillery or RPG round, whatever you want to call it. But now everything is changing. First of all, due to the high consumption of systems and orders that are placed, prices have gone up in China, which is logical, which is also sometimes makes it more palatable for Ukrainians to try and establish their own production for boards and stuff like that. TT actually pointed that Ukrainians have started to actually, with Chinese parts, make their own quote-unquote boards. But now, given that the price is going up for both the frames, the engine, and so on top of that, using thermal cameras, you are coming very close to a artillery round. And for the Russians, that's also another problem, given that on top of the fact that they produce themselves, so the cost for them, like what Rusi said, that everything was 30% more expensive. That's simply not the case. The problem is the following. What is more expensive is actually the inflation, the general inflation for Russia. According to Western scholars, the reality is a bit more different, but it doesn't really matter. There is a rise of costs when it comes to much of the systems. But that rise of cost, for instance, if we take the FPVs, is not 30%. For the Russians, due to the new application and equipment and so on, we are speaking up to 5 times or 500%. The same is applicable to the Ukrainians themselves. On top of it, Russia can still control part of its money printing scheme, because it still takes hard currency on its own sales. Of course, a lot of people would say, oh, it's better to go on credit for that. I would agree in normal terms, but here in this difference, taking credit would need collateral. And for the Russians right now, the few collaterals they can offer without touching the National Wealth Fund and so on would be what? Would be gold, would be transfer of technologies and stuff like that. This is still retained by the Russians, especially towards China, as a last resort transaction logic. For Ukrainians, that doesn't exist. They are now thinking, if the American help doesn't come, because the European one, even if it comes, the only thing it could do is facilitate the quote unquote mobilization, but there are bills to pay. Ukrainians, despite the whole logic that they are starting to re export grain and stuff like that, they are still largely deficitary. I don't know if you guys know, but the GDP follow ups for the Ukrainian economy are all but gone. We had this great year-on-year transformation when everybody expected the Ukrainian economy to crash over 50%, 60%. They managed to stay roughly around 35%, although the Ukrainian National Bank said 29.8 or something like that. The reality is that Ukrainians lost between 34 and 41%, given to the fact that Ukraine still needs to pay money that was due, but that was frozen for 2 years. So this year, unless the war changed radically, Ukraine would have to still be left on the hook for another $6 billion, just like it happened in 2022. So overall, the problem with Ukraine, once again, as I said, it's not only the equipment, it's not only the supplies, it's not only the manpower, it's the whole system that is completely imploding. Manpower being pulled from the. Okay, guys, we are back. I don't know what's going on with Twitter recently. It's systematically after like half an hour, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, we have the same problem with the spaces. So I want to go back to what I said. So basically, what Ruth is ignoring in the whole analysis is like just going towards the Russian side, aligning some numbers, saying Russia lost that much, can produce this much, this and that. Most of it was rather shallow and baseless, especially on the artillery side. They were starting to count like almost 5,000 artillery pieces. This, if you count the mortars and so on, maybe you could go around 3,000, but generally, as I said, 5,000 pieces around that front are simply not manageable. It could be that in reserve, as I said, you can have between 2.5 and 2.7, while having like 1.6 deployed. But it doesn't make sense to have those 4,000 pieces just firing rounds. On top of it, as I said, if you still have those, I'd say roughly 50 pieces per kilometer on the different flash points of the front, which is between 2 and 300, you would see a completely different approach. And even now, the Russians are being extremely more cautious. Artillery losses have been going down. Those counted by Oryx are roughly around 1,250, 1,300 in every kind of damage, destroyed, captured, abandoned, whatever, as you know. And that makes a huge difference generally when it comes to the fact that the Russians, despite that they are 2 years on, they have managed to reduce the losses of the artillery to less than basically, I'd say 1.5 a day, 1.6 a day. It's extremely low, honestly, guys, given the type of war that Russians are waging for now 722 days. The biggest problem for Ukraine as it stands right now is that despite everything that was discussed, remember, we're calling 20 artillery per day in Zaporizhzhia and so on. The Ukrainians are very far from it. During Zaporozhye, verified losses were very low. It was, I think, under the 0. Now that we have the whole counter, under the 0.5 per day, which did not represent what part of the front line Zaporizhzhia represented in the combat itself. So, as I said, problems with the Ukrainians that the whole system is crumbling. They need a actual real thought process behind it, and what Ruth is doing right now is something that I'm often guilty of, which is showing what Ukrainians are going through and what is bad for them. This I do not do by just to hide what the Russians are losing. Quite the contrary, as you heard me, I always give the numbers that I think are accurate. Most of the times they're not nice for the Russian side, but they're based on a couple of explanations why the Russians act like that. If you recently have seen some claims by a lot of Ukrainians and Ukrainian commentators that are in contact with the front line or are in the front line, they would explain to you that the current loss of Avdiivka happened 3 to 4 months ago. And 3 to 4 months ago, everybody on the Ukrainian side was dancing on burnt Russian tanks and burnt Russian vehicles. But as I already told you from the beginning, what the Russians accepted from now on, especially with the FPV threat, is that there will not be no free lunch. But the point is that the first trust should put you past a certain level of defense, past certain lines, which then are just going to make the situation worse for the defenders uh, at any given tactical situation. So, for instance, this was the exact same plan that Ukrainians wanted to do in Zaporozhye during the counter. It is go through the lines of defense, be behind the Russian fortifications, and then start exploiting when the thrust is pushing forward. Basically, cause panic. The Russians understood that this was not going to happen in Zaporozhye, but also understood that whatever they were going to apply as force was not going to happen the same way. The difference with the Russians, as I said, is that once they saw the losses mount, but the advance started to creep, they didn't start to say, "Oh my God, we have lost everything. We're gonna stop this and gonna reduce the push and so on." No, they doubled down, and they managed to a level of destruction and attrition on the other side, which is facilitating what's happening now. Of course, there were specific moments. For instance, the guys at Rusi said that the Russian qualitative didn't grow up. I'm sorry, but the way Avdivka is going, it is because some Zigro bros literally did some plumbing, especially in the south, tunneling, exploitation of existing infrastructure from the Soviet time, and they managed to do that and seize the momentum on the south, which allowed them to collapse multiple lines. And once they were installed, we have the situation currently, which is that the south is the most promising killing field for the Ukrainians. It's not up north in Krasnogorivka because they can still, move out relatively unharmed until Lastochkino, and that the Russians are trying to fix by moving a lot of troops towards the fields at Lastochkino. If you see the latest Kop State map, latest Petrenko map, latest Infactum, latest Siberboroshno, every single Ukrainian fucking mapper is shitting their pants because what the Russians couldn't manage to go through empty fields for over a year, they're doing in 2 months after they broke the first water treatment plant up north. And this, once again, was facilitated by the fact that you have cover through houses, through the streets of Avdiivka, the periphery, the eastern periphery, and then the center of the city. Once again, this didn't happen by magic. This happened by people being more aware, knowing more, being more qualified, qualitatively superior. Of course, people, if you fucking send them in the field to cross an area for many reasons, they're gonna get plastered by FPV, artillery, tanks, whatever. That might sound initially as a wastage, and in many cases it was. It was literally, well, drawing fire from the Ukrainian side to go and visit them with whatever. This bait and chicken game, of course, is wasteful. On the other side, the problem with the war as it stands, and something that Russia didn't touch, is that the biggest problem on both sides right now is that there is no more privacy, there is no more secrecy. On the Russian side, there are so many layers surveying them, but on the Ukrainian side, it's just the same now when it comes to up to 60, 70, 80 kilometers from the front. And because the Russians now have this localized ISR around the clock, and because the Russians can choose with this localized ISR what area to target, it doesn't matter that they do not have a perfect picture all over the place. What they need is the level at the line, the secondary line, and then the third line. So basically, they need last mile logistics, and they need the rear reinforcement. This means that they can preview whatever counter would happen within 72 hours. So let's say that they're going to advance towards Pokrovsk. They know that what is behind it and what is around it, so they can plan ahead to how many people are going to die. Sorry to say it like this, how many people are going to die to achieve a certain task. And this is something that Ukrainians to this day, after the absolute shit show of the counter, both in Bakhmut and in the Zaporizhia axis, cannot replicate. And this is what I'm going to repeat it, this is what the Rusi analysis is not doing. They are just speaking about the Russians in a complete separation from Ukraine. So yeah, the Russians need to fire about gonna have a disposal to fire about 2.1 million rounds, 4,000 barrels. These numbers are empty. First of all, they're wrong. I already did the analysis. So far, I do not believe that 1,500 tanks were delivered. What I do believe that about 1,200 tanks were refurbished or produced, but the rest of those 300 was probably cannibalized from whatever was salvaged during the restoration process on the field. Why? Because there are certain tanks that we are seeing on the Russian side who literally are salvage projects. On the Ukrainian side, we saw just the same. I mean, like you had T-72B, B1 hulls with BA or B3 turrets, and then you got the whole fucking madness with the T-72Ms that sometimes the tank turret has been pulled from one M and added to a Bulgarian furnished M. The turret was a Polish one. I mean, there are a lot of ass hattery going on also with that. So this is also the other problem. The Ukrainians, when we see what they are doing with the Czechs, the fact that they have delivered zero hulls and turrets to be repaired, and I said part of it is probably due to the money, the fact that they don't want to get money out of the country, but it also shows that they have to use every single resource at their disposal. And this is the biggest problem that we have with our friends in Ukraine. Ruzi completely forgets this. For Ruzi, it's fine. Attrition is going to do its job. But I also explained that the problem with attrition, if you start giving away ground, so space for time, in order to commit to your counter, this is exactly what went wrong with the counter in the summer. The space that was given away during 2022 was way too big, and the time that supposedly was won to rearm, etc., worked also for the other side. So when it comes to the space for time in order to prepare a counter, I used a very simple metric. The analysis from the losses with the time spent, but also the square kilometers earned by the counter, with that level of artillery they had before, so basically almost a pristine artillery, because they had quote unquote all their counter brigades equipped. So, but I think over 240 artillery barrels. That allowed them only, as I said, a maybe 400 real square kilometers gained. And for those 400 square kilometers, they lost at least 70 vehicles. I am more around the thousand, but even at like 700 vehicles, and you just divide and you know how much it is. We have also confirmation by Ukrainians that, for instance, Syrski engaged 1/3 of the forces to Bahmut, and we saw with images what it gave. So, for Ukrainians, the point is, where do you gonna have your optimum when you pull back as much as you can allow them to pull back, in order that when you push forward, the ground you need to cover, with the losses that go with that ground, are not gonna fucking just do what they did during the summer, which is completely exhaust you, and therefore establishes not only a stalemate, because this is the thing. Zaluzhin spoke about a stalemate. It's not a stalemate. A stalemate is when both sides are at the same point in capability, in technological approach, in vision, and they literally say, okay, it's fucked. Such things we had in World War One, such thing we had in the Korean War, but that's not the thing with this musical chair idea here. The problem with Zaluzhny saying it's a stalemate is that when he pointed out it was a stalemate, the Russians were counterattacking. So what the counter on Ukrainian side made possible is, as I said, completely deplete the Ukrainians and allow the Russians to hit back on the depleted Ukrainian force. When they chose a very specific area when it was most beneficial to them. Basically, as I said, pushing the Donetsk axis in order to gain more terrain and sanctuarize Donetsk, but also create this double ballast side up and down, which puts the danger both in Konstantinovka, but also towards Ugledar. This thing is not a stalemate. The only stalemate you can claim right there is when you look at the map. It said, okay, the advances are small. Like the Russians should have taken like 180 square kilometers to 200 with the end of Avdiivka, maybe 400, 500. The problem, though, is that on the initiative side, the Russians are going now for beyond the 4 months that Ukrainians risked, as I said. And on those 4 months, Ukrainians literally stopped when they saw that they were going to lose the whole equipment within 2 to 3 months. We're not speaking about 50%, 60%, 70%. We're saying that if the counter went the way it went the first 3 days, within 2 to 3 months, the whole equipment prepared for the counter was gone, plus extras. So basically, now we wouldn't have the situation of a creeping offensive from the Russian side and a reluctant retreat from the Ukrainians. Of course, they get their ass kicked. They do not like leave the ground and say, okay, you know what, you can have it. I don't even know it anymore. No, it's very different. As I said to you, the biggest problem that we have right now is to know how much Ukrainians are relenting and how much they are being pushed out. And according to everybody on the Ukrainian side, given the complaints and everything, they are not relenting. On Avdiivka, we saw that some components of Navoz were sent to help, open up. In Pobieda, we have a problem. In Peromaisk, it's a problem. Novomikhalovka, as I said, Moskal is in the fucking city. The advance next to Ugledar is problematic because now there is a double advance, one that tries to cut the highway, as I said, but another one that's creeping from the east. On top of it, there are strikes, multiple strikes from the Russian aviation. At the front line right now, the Su-34s are having a fucking ball. And the danger with that is that we do not see, they managed to sneak a Patriot 50 kilometers to shoot the EL-76. Okay, could have been also allowed by the Russians in a very absurd bait, but there is no Air Force operating at the front lines right now. To the contrary, we are to a certain point when we see a turntable situation with the latest Mi-24-8 that was shot by ATGM, in stark reminder that what goes around comes around. The way the camels were shot, although in a completely different view because they were stationary, and that here the helicopter got shot while moving around. Uh, we are with this logic, and I'm going to repeat it. We are with this logic when the Ukrainians not only have immediate tactical problems, but they're giving all the wrong answers to make their strategic situation worse. Now, on this is completely ignored by Russia, and it's logical. They are peddling bullshit since the beginning. Sometimes they were right in the sense that Russians were not ready for the kind of warfare they tried to uh, operate within the first 3 to 4 months. But since then, there has been a systematic misunderstanding of what Russia is about right now. And I started by literally saying that we don't even fucking have a proper list of objectives. We are 2 years in this war in about 8 days. We still do not know how the fuck the Russians are going to deal with what they're going to call their victory. And I put a certain layer, so the decommunization aspect, uh, denazification, demilitarization, all these three aspects finally are interchangeable because most of the military apparatus within Ukraine at the beginning of the war was a Soviet legacy. And on that aspect, demilitarizing Ukraine by taking out most of its remotes, its factories, its military industrial complex, and all that stuff is being done in a very weird way, but it's still being done. The decommunization, as I said, well, basically take out what were left by the Soviet Union. We would like the dams to go down and the bridges, but and finally, the denazification is complete, utter, mind-blowing bullshit because, well, who the fuck cares that there are Nazis in Ukraine? Ukraine represents a security threat for Russia, first and foremost. That Ukraine is led by Nazis, by communists, by the fucking aliens, it doesn't matter. The problem is that Ukraine is an opponent. Ukraine could be led, I'm sorry to tell you guys, by fucking Yushchenko. Or by Gas Queen. It wouldn't matter about the quote-unquote Nazification, denazification. It could fucking be Medvedchuk, but if that guy would go the EU side, sorry, they would be still quote unquote denazified. So all this, the initial layer that the Russians served as bullshit led to the second one, which is, as I said, no NATO within the territory, and of course a reduced military. So basically, we went from a rhetorical target, a quasi emotional and autistic logic, to something a lot more palatable and logical. It's a security problem, so basically no fucking NATO, no EU, and of course that security problem means that you need to not have enough forces to threaten Russia. So basically the military was supposed to shrink to 60,000. And then with the war advancing, as I said, you would have the problem where you cannot now start speaking for the whole of Ukraine. What you're going to do is going to start a punishment of both the failures of the early Russian operation, but at the same time, also to remind Ukraine that my guy, at the end of the day, that I take 5% of you, 20% of you, or the whole of you, this shit is not yours anymore. So you have this logic of annexation, and that annexation with the four oblasts plus Crimea, um, basically is where, as I said, we find Russia on its most self-aware place. But ignoring this movement, this fluidity of goals to where it is right now and what the Russians are trying to do right now, means that you are going to completely ignore what the reality on the ground is as well. Like Rusi guys were speaking about how the Russians are going to start influencing left and right. There is no Russian influence left and right. The fact that Trump is going to fucking stab Biden and trying to try to trash Democrats with a so-called border crisis in America. I'm sorry, that's a fucking imperial problem. It's just a different way. Actually, not even a different way. Back in the Roman Empire, a lot of people were starting to put themselves left and right, and you had punitive, uh, well, expeditions on the marches towards whoever would try to get inside. And sometimes it would be an invasion, a proper one with people with sharp blades and shit. Sometimes would be people were fleeing a fucking invasion and were trying to have some kind of stability or protection sometimes. So historically, the whole point of what's going on to the U.S. is just the sign of a imperial power having to deal with the fact that it overgrew its initial scope. Let's say it like this. So when we go back to the core problem with the Rusi analysis is that they completely ignore what doesn't fit the narrative. But this we knew already, but it also leads to something that is completely stupid. Um, as I said, the quality analysis is stupid. It's akin to what was said that we put the Russians back 18 years in their uh, modernization. I'm like, bitch, 18 years ago there was no Lancet. 18 years ago these guys were designing UMPKs, but there were fucking maquettes hanging on roofs in military exhibitions. Now, of course, it's a ghetto UMPK, but it still blows Ukrainians out of the fucking water. Uh, there is a systematic modernization of the Russian military kit at the infantry level. How was it done? These guys are using 10,000 different apps that come from mountaineering to orientation to actual creating targeting systems. We had that with the God's Eye for mortars that was used recently. You got the FPV explosion, but a drone and unmanned system complete explosion on the Russian side as well. And there are current field applications. So the whole logic of, you know, lesser quality of the Russian troops and no evolution of it, as Rusi tries to say that it's just fucking sheer numbers, it's completely stupid. It is stupid because now the Russians are with, according to Rusi, not any qualitative jump with older weapons, because you know that was also the meme. Oh, now the Russians have T-75 and yeah, 75, sorry, T-55. Oh yes, fine. Imagine that with the T-55 you beat back the biggest force preparation on the Ukrainian side, and then you start regaining your territory all over the place. I'm fine with the T-55 being the first weapon, guys. Like, of course, I have a bit of a nostalgia of it, but apparently, according to Nafoids and the Rusi guys, Russia with older weapons works better than with modern weapons. It's paradoxical, but apparently, given what I see to the map, and if I have to believe Rusi, it is like that. Worse tactics, worse weapons, just numbers. This, of course, is bullshit because both sides complain about the so-called strong points and and advantages of the other side, while in nature there is no big difference between the two. It's just an application and posture. Russians need to have visibility because they are on the offensive. Ukrainians can stay hidden. That's also what you're seeing with FPVs on the Russian side. If you see Sudoplatov, they have whole segments attacking trenches, attacking fortifications. Ukrainians are attacking mostly vehicles. It's normal. They need to do stop logistics, they need to stop attacks, and so on and so on. So once you put that on the lens of the posture, so who has the initiative, what you want to do with it, and so on, you start to understand. Of course, are there excess losses, wastage on the Russian side? Yes, I already said. Unfortunately, Russian F chose to just like fucking go full throttle at it in order to knock the Ukrainians from certain positions, certain points, certain salients. And this is what's going on with Avdiivka. For 3 months, it was a fucking chore. But now, since they broke down Tsarska Khotka and the Ukrainians started to panic by being encircled and infiltrated, that's what I said, once they're going to be in the city itself is going to become urban combat, Ukrainians do not have a chance because the whole dispositive that they had is that the Russians needed to be outside, get FPV'd, artillery, whatever you want to call it, and then get stuck and be visible, and then you can treat them, one by one. This is also what's happened with most of the territories that Ukrainians gained in Zaporozhye and in South Donetsk. Urozhanye, Blagodat, and so on, Robotino. Robotino lasted until these guys came to the city like 65, 67 days. Once they were close enough, and they advanced in, it was rather quickly done. Within 5 days, the Russians had left for the external perimeter defense. And this is exactly what I told you that was going to happen. The whole point was to stop the Russians from getting inside the city. Once they were there, what happened? Are these Russians stupid? No, it is very simple. Both sides are going to apply the same tactics because the same threats are applicable. Russi completely ignores this. What Russi is saying, like, oh, it's going to be just attrition. Ukraine's not going to lose anything. And by staying at a distance in this contactless war, they are not going to risk anything. The problem is that then you start having the same discussion that we have had multiple times. If you are going to fight on a distance, you need to have the assets to fight from a distance. Artillery, FPVs, long-range guns, maybe some tanks. But this means, and I'm going to repeat it, or Baba Yagas, drones, doesn't matter, it's more or less the same thing. If you have this contactless war, and you're not at contact most of the time, but you bring danger to the other side while it's advancing, it's transit in open fields, is that you're going to be submitted to the same kind of counter battery because that's the only thing you're going to show. Artillery, drone positions. And the Russians now have the tools to start targeting you more or less accurately on those starting positions. UMPKs are literally transforming parts of Avdiivka in sarcophagus for the Ukrainian troops. And it doesn't matter if the bomb misses for 10 meters, the over 250 kilograms of explosive in that bomb are going to make your day extremely shitty at 10, 15, 20 meters if you are not under cover. And if you are, but the building collapses on you, big fucking deal. And this is the thing that Russia is trying hard to ignore. By not giving the second aspect of it, so basically the B face of this war situation, Russia is guilty of something that I said sometimes I'm as well in my timeline because I'm just, of course, showing Ukrainian losses and Ukrainian mishaps. But the thing is that when we speak about this situation, I'm the first to say how much people I think and I have researched are lost on the Russian side. I'm the first to say this was a shit show, this was a shit show, this was a shit show. This is missing when Russia and all these Western think tanks, there is no logical view on it. Either they're gonna fucking start a panic because it's a attempt to have more for Ukraine, where you literally have this what happened with CNN. On one side, Ukrainians are posting call about Russians complaining getting hit by arty for the whole day while they fire only a couple of rounds. But on the other side, you got CNN showing, we have only 4 elimination rounds, and this is what all we have. So this complete schizophrenia on the Rusi and also most of the EU, US, Western think tanks creates a chasm between the reality and the narrative, to where most of us are going to have a problem finding the truth. And sometimes you're going to have the side you support making it easier for the other side. The Russians, by publishing only coal as well for the advanced in Avdiivka, Pseudo-Platov, by posting 3 to 4 week old FPV strikes, create this fact that, oh my God, we are not advancing and so on. And then you learn the extent of the disaster for the other side when they post their own calls. So like you got these guys on their Max Pro hitting from the complete extreme Western positions next to the coke plant, and they go back and they get targeted by mortars, artillery, whatever it was, and they just the fuck get back. You can understand the problem when you see that. And of course, for us, communication is not that important. What is going on for both militaries is, as I said, a completely different version of PR. On one side, you have the Russians publishing dry shit that you wouldn't believe because it sounds stupid. And on the other side, you're going to have the Ukrainians posting very good footage for what they want to show you. But then you need to apply both to the map, but also apply both to what you're seeing. And as I said, Ukrainians love showing right now, because they're losing, old footage that they kept under wraps, because Russians try to not show where they are. But it's stupid, because the guys on the ground on the Ukrainian side, unfortunately, have a better communication loop. When they lose that communication loop, is that it's completely fucked up. And then the Russians are completely beyond the point when you want to, communicate. So it even doesn't matter. Just as I said, look at the call that is being posted right now. We had Dmitry posting a old shit from November that he himself started to geolocate, and you can see like, oh yeah, it's there. And then you go to a deep state map. I did that, and you see, oh, bro, you're speaking about something that was happening in November. Of course, there's the weather and so on. But the problem with Rusi is not all the numbers, all the calculations that I made. Is the fact that, and I think one of the tweets was, they are paid to lie. I wouldn't say they paid to lie, but at some point, every single outlet out there, once the Ukrainians weren't started to win, started to twist and turn shit around. Even Butuzov, who's a propagandist, but most of the time he would say some technical truths. When Avdiivka started to tank, I made a post about it. Now it's gone because martyrdom of Pipistrello. But I showed you the problem with even kind of like Butuzov and Saplenko and Petrenko. All these people at some point see the truth, don't want to say it. This was one of the biggest problems the Russians had in 2022. And it's still there. The difference is that the positive is now far exceeding the negative, and some lies don't exist. Latest of this shit show is what they did with the water tower in Krinky. Every single motherfucking Ukrainian propagandist started saying how the fuck they advanced. Honestly, I'm gonna say, guys, if you want to shit on someone who supposedly is knowledgeable, just see what DPA fucking wrote. Defense Politics Asia wrote that the Ukrainians had pushed the Russians out of the forest belt had installed the flag on the water tower. And I'm like, nigger, what? I'm sorry, I said that word. What the fuck is even this? How did they go? We have bombardment on the Russian side, very recent, that places most of the Ukrainian troops 800 meters from the position. And they're getting fucking hit. If you want to see what Krinky looks like, just look at Russian footage and also their own footage from the ground. They are in fucking holes on both sides. It's literal Rattenkrieg. And unfortunately, because the impetus to get that ground is on the Russians are going to show off, are going to get FPV'd. And this is the whole situation when most of the losses in Krinky right now are artillery and small boats on the Ukrainian side. A fuck ton of them, but it's just that. While Russia's going to lose, like, I don't know, 30, 40 tanks, AVs, EAVs, BTRs. And of course, it looks nice. Oh, all these Russian losses, man. We're doing great. Reality, they're stuck there for now 4 months, and their major victories is literally jumping from one hole to the other during the night through the marshes, and say we control the area. At the same time, between 2 to 3 times a week, they get out of those holes that had at the most extensive part of the territory of Krinky, and they get back 200 to 300 meters to avoid getting a fab in the face. And then they have time to fucking drop a flag somewhere, and it's literally the same shit every single time. The PR on the Ukrainian side is completely blinding them. And therefore, you have this complete schizo reality where Ukraine is so winning and there are so many Russian losses, but the problems who have arisen with one side about mobilization, capability of fire, and so on are on the Ukrainian side. On top of it, as I explained on the thread, Russian losses are on the same level as they were in 2023. How they're going to evolve, that's something else. Maybe they're going to go completely crazy. But right now, there is no evolution for 2023, especially because in 2023, they started with this shitty operation in Ugledar, which already took out a chunk of equipment that makes it so, I'd say, close in perspective on both sides. And this is the biggest problem. The Russians know that much is going to get lost. That we destroy Ukrainian vehicles or not, this doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for the Russians because, as I said, they have considered that the expenditure of the year. And then they're just looking for the budget. If it, as I said, 5% or 10% lower, it's a great fucking way because you spared money, quote unquote, or assets, quote unquote, so you can force to the next budgetary session. On the Russian side is a cynical, technocratic, and callous. You can call it like that. But that's how a fucking numbers war works. Everybody on the Ukrainian side who's pretending differently, who's speaking about willpower and so on, if your willpower made you be better, you are not going to be in a fucking kettle in Avdiivka right now. You are not getting fucking FPV'd. Your willpower, if it's the true engine of this fucking combat, should make you be right now in Donetsk. You are going to Pokrovsk, my man. It's the other side around. And this is all the small thing that I'm not saying this is going to stay like this forever. I already said that at some point the Ukrainians, with the strategy of sparing as much as they can, be that vehicles, be that artillery, be that ammunition, at some point they're going to start seeing cracks in the Russian this position, and I think those cracks, and I said this already, if the Russians are smart, they feint those cracks once they take Avdiivka. Once they take Avdiivka, they start pushing on the flanks and not going beyond Semenivka right now. In order for the Ukrainians to make the same mistake they made with Bakhmut. Of course, Bakhmut was a bit different because the counter was announced, they had the equipment and so on. So far, most of the equipment that the Ukrainians might recover is Leopard 2 that's going to get repaired, aggregated with the unfortunate Abrams who hasn't been shown up, aggregated with some Leopard 1s, and maybe some extra tanks from Bulgaria or from, God forbid, Cyprus, because those are two ATUs. So if we see the whole logic of the Ukrainian strategy, we need to check for fillers. And those fillers would be artillery barrels, ammunition. We know that Europe had announced that. So for March, I think a batch is going to come about 200,000. So they would have something. That's why I said in March we might see a revamping of the Ukrainian artillery. But we need the tubes. If the F-16s are ready, probably those are going to be employed almost immediately. And the biggest problem I have, let's be honest, with all this is, what if the Russians want it? It's not just an operational pause, but like, okay, we're gonna stabilize the positions, but not pushing too far. That's exactly what happened with Bakhmut. They knew that the counter was coming Zaporizhia. That caused also the spat between Wagner and the Ministry of Defense. And losses, please. Wagner did so much damage to itself, and I already counted the losses in artillery, which were staggering for the front. The biggest problem, I think, that the Russians have this rinse and repeat approach, and they always had, and they're gonna see if within March, April, they are in the positions where we think that there should be. So basically, Oskil, basically Semenivka or beyond, basically cutting Ugledar off and pushing the front line to that 0532 road. I mean, if this happens, then the Ukrainians need to get back more or less the same kind of territory they took back in 4 months during the counter, but this time they're not moving towards Zaporizhia. This time they will have to move towards Donetsk in order to avoid the loss of Konstantinovka. If Konstantinovka is lost, all the best, but the loss of the sister cities up north. And the Donbass front is completely different for Ukraine. It's a lot more problematic. We saw that with Bakhmut. Bakhmut was a very limited front, and Ukraine didn't manage to crack it. Although they had huge successes in the first 2-3 weeks compared to what happened later. Don't forget that Donetsk, the areas in Donetsk that needs to be attacked, are also every single time at the advantage of the Russians. Donetsk can serve as a complete cluster of logistics, 40 kilometers up, 40 kilometers down. That's a huge problem for whoever wants to attack on that line. And also, once Ugledar is falling, and I said the line is going to the 03532, you reduce also by not that much, but by 20 kilometers the front down in Zaporozhye. All these things Russi doesn't see. For Russi, what matters is just attrition. Oh, the whole point now is to kill as many Russians so the Russians cannot fucking be a threat. And I'm like, it doesn't work. It's not that the Russian resources are endless or whatever, but it doesn't work. This was 2 years on when everything on the Ukrainian side was better, quote unquote, when they had more artillery, when HIMARS was a very dangerous threat compared to what it is right now. What is going to change is the planes, that's true, and some more long range assets. But overall, the logic of now trying to bring the war to Russia is not going to work the same way they think. And once again, as I said, the problem is they cannot exploit blowing up a refinery or the component of a refinery in Russia. They're just going to expedite repairs, and instead of doing that for 6 months, they're going to do it from two. And they're going to keep going like that. And the only reality so far for the Ukrainians is also that they need to also brace themselves for counterfire. And once the counterfire comes, as I said, if you check the Merefa refinery and fuel storage, if you check Kremenchuk and so on, nothing has been repaired. These guys are literally using tankers as disposable fuel containers. So overall, the Russia aspect, when you see what's going on right now in Donbass, is crazy. Of course, in the long term, they might be right. You never know. But when you compare what you're seeing to what is being said, and when the guy said, yeah, the ammunition production is going to be limited to 3 million all in, and I'm like, how? There are so many places the Russians can reactivate. We had this very early on in 2022 when a pipe company was started to make mortar rounds. On top of it, the acquisition of high precision machines from China actually creates more of a advantage for Russia, because once those Chinese machines, that money is going from China to Russia, is not leaving the circle, because one of the problems the Russians are committing right now is that the money is still going to Europe for a large part of the specialized equipment, and therefore you got a loss of money. Of course, the Europeans are paying for fuel that was bought by traders to Russia, so that exchange, most of it nullifies itself, or it's still in advantage of the Russian economy on that trade surplus. But once it gets to China, you don't give that money to your fucking enemy. Of course, that enemy can, yeah, the current friend can become an enemy later. We have always seen this scenario unfolding. But right now, the Chinese do not want any kind of trouble in the relationship with Russia, because that's their door to numero uno globally. And not because Russia is a huge market, no, but Russia offers them security in so many levels, starting by the military security with the nukes and the huge border towards the west, that allows China, if shit hits the fan, to have such a fucking huge, I repeat it, a huge strategic depth. They can fucking reach us in Europe and can reach the US on the other side. So this quote unquote unholy union of the bear and the dragon, if you read Charap in the latest round, I don't agree with everything on that report. It's 153 pages, but a lot of it boils in 3 to 5 pages. So But if you reach up, this is exactly what is fucking scaring Washington now, because what they thought was that, first of all, China was not gonna bail out Russia, or at least was going to bail out by a loan. Secondly, the war is not going how they thought. Like, they thought probably Russia gonna get a fucking bloodied nose. They're gonna tap out, and we're gonna start slapping them with sanctions, and we're gonna make sure that they don't touch China anymore in any significant way. What's happening now is completely different. Um, the Chinese and the Russians are going hand in hand for a lot of projects. And of course, there are some setbacks. Everybody's going to point out to, oh, Chinese banks now, they are starting to suspend accounts with the Russian zone. I'm going to tell you guys the funny part with that, you're going to see bootleg banks started to be created in China in order to sustain that thing. So those banks wouldn't be submitted to sanctions. There are many ways to do this. There is gold payments, whatever you want. And this is the most critical component right now. The Chinese, despite everything that is coming from the US, they have all the interest in the world to do two things. As I said, either the longest war possible, so Russia is forced to, at some point, to contract a kind of debt with China, and the US, being dragged in this long war, starts to spend money on shit they do not need in a war against China. But most importantly, whatever happens with the war, Europe is the biggest loser in this big block uh, fight. That much you know already. I've said it multiple times. On one side, you got the Chinese taking Russia out of the equation for Europe. On the other side, Europe is losing a alternative to the American LNG, because, as I said, Norway is nice and everything with the pipe gas, but they already had half of what they're selling right now in contracts with other people within the EU. Once they get bingo, or they start to lower the production in order not to completely exhaust their proven reserves, then the reliance on the US or on gas from Qatar or whatever grows exponentially. But then you have the exact same problem we had before. Okay, the US might be your friend, quote unquote, your partner, your umbrella, your nuclear and security umbrella, but at this at the same time, they're going to take advantage to their dominant position in your market, and this is going to be a litmus test for the EU and the European Commission, which fought rapidly to stop Russia from being a part of the oligopoly within the energy market in Europe. But now, what's going to happen is that they're going to have the US occupying that role slowly, slowly. So how would it fit with Europe's own rules? Once again, this is completely a sideshow. I don't think that's because America is going to dominate the European energy market in a way or another, that suddenly the Europeans are going to get all mad and go reverse patriot on the US. No, I just think that Europe is going to fundamentally go to the gutter, because there would be nothing else. The same way that for Russia, the main alternative would be China. And that's exactly what, in my opinion, as a European, that should never have happened, because it settles the situation, the security architecture in Europe for probably a long term, 25, 30, 35 years, in which everything's going to brew in a way or another. But for Europe, if there is no solution found on the near broad relationship, which means Middle East, Near East, Russia, Northern Africa, Europe is going to start getting gutted. And there is a lot of talk about that. Like, you know, more migrants and so on. The problem is not that much the migration. The problem is that, unlike before, when the migrants were brought in, there was a steady development, and you got the golden 30, and so on. But now most of development has completely gone away from the hardcore productivity and the real economy. Just if you want to see the UK. The UK has a huge problem with a large financial sector within its GDP, but this financial sector, most of it is money laundering. Sorry to say it like this, guys. You can be happy or not. And once we are in that logic, this that you have this gray, black, or whitewashed capital, there is no investment in GB itself, or very little compared to what was in China, what was in developing countries. So with people like Rusi or Rand, on one side you got the Rand guys who fear a cataclysmic collapse of Europe, not like, oh my God, we're gonna kill each other or we're gonna become poor from today to tomorrow, but slowly we are going to become both a graying continent, so less people overall, and in order to sustain that exponential growth that should keep us up technologically, militarily, economically, we will have to import people. And one of the solutions would have been to import Ukrainians. But if we kill them off and these guys get gobbled by Russia, the influx of these refugees is not going to be lasting, because it's not like we are taking them from a direct competitor. Like, for instance, if we would take them from Russia, it would be okay. But we are taking to a place when we wanted them to stay on the spot. We wanted these people to stay in Ukraine, not to come back. It's the same thing that happened with the Balkans. Everybody's happy now that supposedly some vital statistics are better and the economy is doing better, whatever, which is a fig leaf. Everything must be compared to, the day-to-day logic. But a lot of people from the Balkans just went to Europe. The quote-unquote European dream literally is gutting our nations. And this is, something that you cannot save now. The same thing is going to be once, as I said, Europe is not going to be able to generate the same kind of investment appeal and the same kind of productivity, the same kind of industrial power. Then we are done. Because if this swap is from us to the US, and given that the US has the keys of the European energy sector right now, we basically allowed the US to do exactly what we didn't want Russia to do. And in that periphery, if Russia completely starts to borg with China, it won't be long that Central Asia makes the connection with Turkey, and Turkey makes the connection with the Middle East. So, on a sense, what is being decided right now is the fault lines of who we are. We're gonna reassume a role that we had during the Cold War, but instead of having just the Soviet Union, we're gonna have the rest of the Eurasian continent. Of course, it's not going to be this obvious. There's not going to be some kind of golden horde army that's going to fucking come to Europe. No, these things go slowly, then accelerate. Look at the Russian gas situation. For a while, the European Commission, with American pressure, tried to kill many initiatives, including Nord Stream 1 and 2. Changes were made to the energy market to stop Russia from buying assets within the countries, like storage space, like management companies, like energy companies, and so on. This thing had nothing to do with Russia trying to take over whole sectors of Germany. Of no, for Russia it was a protection of its investment. It's logical. If tomorrow Germany stops buying Russian gas pre February 22, 2022, Russia has no incentive and no alternative, no incentive to seek elsewhere, because it would take a lot of problems. And also, who the fuck is going to, uh, buy you in reverse? The fact that China went to Russia to buy oil and gas is because Russia was slashing the prices. But if you are in this open market and Europe refuses initially to buy your gas and you slash your price, and then Europe comes back and establishes a completely different balance between supplier and buyers, which is exactly what Europe tried to do. They tried to make every single contract be bought in bulk by the whole group because it was the consumer's pressure group, and I completely agree with that. But at the same time, the suppliers need to find their value in that deal. So once again, don't forget that one of the biggest problems for Russia and Europe on the current war is that both sides did not respect a unspoken pact when you are dealing with this, trying to find not what you think is the best option for you, but a compromise. Price-wise, the Russians were cheap for a long while. Then Ukrainian shenanigans started when Ukrainians would literally siphon gas from long-term storage from Gazprom and sell it on a small premium to neighboring countries, and then replace that gas from the gas that was supposedly sold to Ukraine for a cheaper price, a preferential price. The whole point with Ukraine, Europe, and Russia is that the European market wanted a unconditional surrender of the Russian market over every single aspect. We are speaking, as I said, power. We are speaking openness of the market. We are speaking conditions, labor conditions within the market. And ironically, the Russians, once they cut the ties more or less with Europe post Crimea, start to implement some of the reforms that would be required by the EU from Ukraine in order to access a very strong, I'd say, conservative, fiscally conservative uh, stance was assumed by Russia. So all the ramifications of all this are needed to explain why Ukraine, despite everything that's been said right now, will have it extremely difficult by external intervention to even come close to stabilize the front where it is now within 1 or 2 years, despite whatever Russia is losing. Most of this equation of the attrition game relies on how much Ukraine is going to lose, not how much Russia. As I said, for the Russians right now, everything needs to be to the 5,000 units, because then they can sustain both with new production and everything. But in order to be something logical, something exploitable, the Ukrainians need to save as much equipment and everything. But to do so, they need to fall silent on many fronts and start fighting in ways that ultimately would allow the Russians to advance. We have the story at Avdiivka. So when one is trying to speak about attrition doesn't work in the current scenario. And attrition is going to work even worse if you are thinking about another type of counter like happened last year. Because for the Russians, it's going to be rinse and repeat. They can wait for you. If you have new toys and new tools, maybe it's going to be different. But if you come with the same type of logic, so basically tanks, maps, IVs, some aerial power, infantry, you're going to have the same welcome committee they had when they tried in Zaporozhye by Bobr. FPVs were a staple of Bobr for at least 1.5 months from June to mid-July. So in absolute terms, nothing is going to change for Ukraine as it stands. Zero. The point is to reduce the advancement of the Russians while also not sacrificing its troops in order to preserve as much possible for an eventual counter. But with the method chosen right now, when they're gonna go far, 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 far by trying to have just delaying actions, they might very well end to the point where the Russians won. And then going back from the position they are towards recovering some of the lost territory of all the lost territory during the Russian offensive is going to cost them maybe not as much as the Russians, but a lot more that they can afford to lose. So this whole attrition tied policy is, in my opinion, and I hope you would agree with me, completely insane. And yeah, maybe some game changes are gonna come. Maybe starting to cripple the Black Sea Fleet, blah blah blah. Maybe starting to cripple the Russian war effort. Whatever. Okay, guys. Third take. I'm very sorry about the situation. This site is getting crappier and crappier every single time. I'm really sorry for what's going on. But to wrap it up, the situation is following. Most of the think tanks right now are addressing the shortcomings of both sides with a lot of cope and a lot of with visual thinking. Um, some of them are going deeper. Honestly, I would recommend you to go to Rand and see the latest Chara piece where he's thinking for post-war. It's very dry. The analysis is not like super deep. You're gonna see there is a lot of bullshit for, as I said, something that could stay in 4 or 5 pages. There are cases that honestly I do not think happening in short or long terms. For instance, the Chinese rearmament of Russia is probably only going to come when the the Russian gambit for the Chinese is going sour because there's an intervention. So basically, if NATO starts a push from the south or from the north, doesn't matter, then indeed the Chinese are going to start talking trash and sending trash NATO's way. Um, the biggest problem that most of the analysts have right now, even on the Russian side, is that they're based on this logic of constant advancement. This constant advancement means that whatever is happening right now is going to keep happening beyond. As I said, I do not see this complete defenseless situation of the Ukrainian army continue beyond March. Because if it's going like this, it's just going to snowball into something that the Ukrainians could not recover. And I do not think that the Americans are ready to just throw them under the bus yet. Uh, it also, I'm sorry, maybe I'm wrong, but it also feels like a American, like inspirational kind of movie when the underdog is almost on the brink of losing, but at the end the cavalry arrives. So This is one of those things that once again I'm very afraid of when it comes to America as a system of political decision, which is sometimes hilarious, but when it comes to the military itself, so the way how the American military uh, operates and the capabilities it has, then if a decision is taken to go into this whole shit show of a regional war, that thing's gonna happen. And unfortunately, it might have different results for everyone. Charap once again avoids this. For him, America is not gonna get involved. But as I said, if this situation is left degrading like this, or there is not a plan. It's very possible we're not seeing it, by the way. Don't forget, we had this idea of systematic advance on Lugansk by the Russian army, and then first Kherson, which was meek, and then Kharkov happened. Now it's a bit more different because the areas where the Ukrainians and the Russians needs to duke it out in Kharkov and Lugansk Oblast are rather unhospitable for any kind of large advancement. And right now, both sides have dug in. But who knows? Like right now, everything's going fine. There is no show of force left and right. There are no pressure points, even where the Ukrainians are bragging with Krinky, for instance. It's ridiculous. It has nothing to do with the reality. And where they're not bragging, and this is the part where they are right now in Avdiivka, they could go completely crazy and launch a senseless counter that might still uh, threaten the Russians enough to stop operations in one direction, relieve whatever the Ukrainians have there, and then go and reinforce the flanks. But so far, so long, it doesn't seem like the Ukrainians can answer in kind. And the introduction of the third Azov from Lastochkina towards the center of the city is showing that, in fact, it might be too late for Avdiivka and the region around Avdiivka. Finally, one last word, and this one is going to be not over production, not over tactics, and so on. One last word is that um, we do not seem to appreciate enough how much faith the Americans and Ukrainians are having on the F-16. Budanov took his time to literally speak about them, um, for which I personally have a huge doubt. It felt like cope. It still feels like cope, but we should be, wary of a proper application of the situation. Now, the biggest mistake I think the Ukrainians are going to make with F-16 is that they're going to give up their hand. So basically, if they get like 15, 20, whatever within a couple of months, they're going to go for an all-out attack. And this is going to betray the pattern. I think, unlike what happened with Atakams and so on, this is going to leave a mark for the Ukrainian Air Force if they do what I think they're going to do, which is a front range attack, probably with ALSMs. That those are going to have the result they're going to have, but they're going to cost them at least one or two planes from that wave. Um, Basically, that was it. I'm very sorry for the extremely chaotic space, but Elon does the Elon thing, so I'm very sorry, guys. I would like to have a different medium for this, but unfortunately, right now Twitter just allows me to make it easier like this. It's time for you guys to express yourself. We're gonna start with General. Go on, man. General, you can go, man. It's your turn, bro.
Okay, hi guys. Sorry if I'm going slow because I read a few points and but I cannot read that much, as you know. But regarding Elon, I was hearing something that probably there are some foreign actors also with hands on Twitter, and even if he has promised, full liberty, these actors are somehow, shaping the narrative as much as they can. So, uh, this being said, you told about the EU and everything, and living in EU as much as you, we are feeling the prices that the VAT is paying that war and those loans that are given out to Ukraine. But if we check that the exports toward Europe were like 60-65% in the 80s and 90s, and now we're down to 40. I think with this war they are going back. So it comes back to that expression of the Admiralty Lord, the first chief of military in the NATO, whom said that NATO's purpose is like keeping US in, Germany down, in this case EU, and Russia out, and it's still going on, this thing. But as you said, both for different reasons, US and Russia too are going, to the Asian pivot, like you said. Now, coming back to the Black Sea, if things are going like this, you know, it's ending up to being a flotilla, but there is a solution, I think. And the solution might come expected and unexpected in the same origin as the Shahids came, the fast attack boats that Iran has, maybe modified with an ATGM night vision for countering these unmanned sea vehicles, sea drones, and with a AK 630, maybe with an updated fire control system. And maybe that's a solution because it is getting painful, and Russia doesn't seem like wanting to retaliate in the same fashion. As you said, you talked about the grain, being the commodity. And I guess it's not just grain, it's also the energy. Because with the all industries that are stopped, that are damaged by this war, they have a huge surplus and they are selling it for hard cash. So maybe it's time to hurt them that cash flow that is coming. We spoke even in private about the air battle that is going to be, and I think it's going to be because the F-16s are coming, and the West has shown that it's pretty much going all in. So we're not talking about A/B Abrams here. I think it's going C-7, C-8, and once Sweden is going into the NATO, I think the Gripen Ace, which are just air defense fighters, are coming too. And these are going to go for the force multiplier. So I think whatever AWACS they might have, and since the Su-34 with the UMPKs is shaping very much the battlefield now, and we can agree on that, man, I guess they are going for them. Their main mission is going to be hunting the land movers, the Su-34s, the Su-25s, and why not? They might even be going for the Kamovs, as because the Ukrainians showed them. I mean, the first attack they used with the ATACMS was the helicopter fields. So it is indicator of something, my man. I think so. That is going to be this the case. So, as the Ukrainians did in the beginning of the war, which all the planes were moved in to the border with Romania and to the bases there, border to Romania and Poland, the Ivano-Frankivsk region. They're gonna do the same. They're just gonna put like 2 or 3 tanks on them, 4 MRAMs, maybe 2 AM9s, and that's it. Once they get close to the front, just dump the wet bags and go on with what they have for, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes of action, and then come back to base. So it's going to be very dangerous because they are going with for on a hunt. They are not going for attacking the bridge. I think that might come as we talked before with Mirage 2000Ds that you mentioned, where will be delivered, and I think with tornadoes also. That's a huge possibility. From Italy, from Germany, even from UK, they might cannibalize and they might have them in reserve and they might put, I don't know, a squadron. But the threat from tornadoes is and from the 2000Ds is very different because they are set up to fly low, and is very much the TFR is very much foolproof, and it might deliver weapons which might hurt a lot and can hurt a lot. And I think that they are still going all in, and that might happen for real. Now, regarding the Rusi, I read the part you explained it about the barrels, and just adding in, I think that the only competitive barrel there on the present front line with a supply of 50 or 52 caliber guns was the Jacinths, and the fact that the reserve, fields where they were in Siberia are missing barrels. It tells us something, and also the SM2 development, which they went with a 60 caliber. I think you said the space before. So, well, these were my points. For the rest, I agree with you. It's going to be a long war. So, attack, counter attack. We shall see. We're just paying the price here in Europe, man. Thank you.
Well, points are extremely interesting, and once again, I agree with you. The only differential factor that I have when it comes to the Air Force, to the aircraft, is the time. I do not see any multi composite force for Ukraine before the end of 2024. First and foremost, because if they are going to send the tornadoes and the Gripens, they need pilots, and this is one of the biggest problems that the Ukrainians have right now. Is that pilot-wise, they are at full tilt. They, if they want to have all these pilots flying all these different systems, something needs to be done when it comes to what they had as licensed pilots and all those who could fly. If we see on the database of what was lost, till now, roughly 400 pilots and former pilots were lost by Ukraine, most of them on aircraft, on fixed wing aircraft. And this is, I think, the biggest problem because some of the pilots were not killed flying. A lot of pilots that were off initially were on the bases, and most of them were not in the flying capacity. Most of them were like officers, and those who were high level officers that were called to fly, that were so because the capacity of the lesser officer corps wasn't there. Now, when you see who is dying more recently on the officer side, you got very young guys and you got also experienced guys, but they are nowhere near the 40 threshold as was the average age at the beginning of the war. When you got all the experienced guys that were clogging the cockpits, those were gone. Now we have a younger generation, probably because there was an effort to try and train them as much as possible. But that is going to prove a challenging point. Most of it is that in order to train these pilots, you cannot fly, training aircraft because Ukraine doesn't have that much to begin with. But so most of the training is going to happen abroad. So that is something that needs to be taken into account. Any kind of training for the tornadoes or a proper training with the Gripen, although it's true that they are supposed to be training for a while now, is going to see most of those planes and their pilots ready around the end of the year 2024, maybe beginning 2025. Now, as I said, my biggest problem here is that, okay, the F-16s are going to come. The quantities that we were speaking about initially, as I said, I'm expecting 36 planes within this year when it comes strictly to F-16s, most of them being used on a cap basis, part of them being used on a ground attack role or a high value targeting. If you add the Mirages, the 2000Ds, I personally, once again, I'm going to repeat, I do not believe that the French would give them modernized. Why? Because the French Armée de l'Air needs them like fucking butter, because they are not ready yet to go to Rafale. I have already posted something in that aspect. I'm gonna find the post from OPEX, so you guys gonna reread it. But 6 to 12 indeed could be very possible, and even with the pre modernization factor, those are going to be extremely problematic for the Russians, especially as they would come with some weapons already integrated instead of being jerry-rigged like the Su-24Ms, the MiG-29s, or and the Su-27s when it came to harm and long-range threats like the Scalp or Jdam ER. Where you are of the Russians having a direct reply initially. So I think, like usual, either the Ukrainians do something stupid and score a couple of flashy points but get shot in between, or they start something small, long range throw ins with Jasm, with Scalp, with whatever, with Taurus, if it's even applicable, and then slowly start, indeed, as you said, to organize hunt parties and go after the Su-34s. My biggest problem is that once you are going to deal with this logic, then the Russians can easily replicate with what we saw was already possible, which is Su-24Ms, M2s, M2Ks, MRs, being equipped with the UMPK. For sure, it's not going to be as easy to employ them. They're going to be literally bomb trucks. But the reality is that on that aspect, the attempt to hunt down the 34th is going to also cause attrition. And while F-16s, as I said, are roughly easily replaceable, the Gripens, the Mirage, okay, the Tornadoes is something different because there are still quite a few to be given. But on the Mirage especially, and the Gripens, the risk is big that they get into a pickle and it ends up with losses on both sides. But the difference, once again, the Russians right now have broken that hubris barrier about losses. They got shut down by Patriot, they got shut down by Nassam, so they got shut down by their own air defenses. Losses now are part of the deal with the Russians. On the other side, you got the same conundrum that we had with the Leopards, that we had with the Western artillery, that we had with the Western infantry fighting vehicles and so on, even with the HIMARS. With the HIMARS, everybody's coping now because we saw two of them damaged. And I was like, it's part of war. You shouldn't consider any single system as invincible or as a sacred cow. And this is how, once again, you start treating this war how it should be, which is a numbers game. However, as you said, the quality jump with the new planes is going to be tremendous. Okay, some airframes on the F-16s are gonna be oldish. The Mirage 2000 Ds, if they are given on the juice, still dripping with the French flight hours, so not refurbished or at least not out of storage or whatever, they are going to have the same kind of problems as the Su-24s. Let's be honest here. So it would require from the French 2 to 3 months refurbishment for the few they're going to send this year, and for the tornadoes, it's going to be the same. My biggest concern on both sides, first of all, the Russians misunderstand the role exactly as you said. So a big part of the Gripen and a part of not a big part, but Gripen is going to be a hunter, and part of the F-16 is going to be a hunter as well. While the two others in between, Tornado and Mirage 2000, are going to be ground attack planes. And then we have another portion, F-16, that who is going to play this ground attack role, or catapult type of system. And this is exactly where we have where we agree, but where I don't agree is that the fact that are coming piecemeal is going to allow the Russians to start having a different vision how they're gonna operate. On top of it, the biggest situation that I foresee already is that some planes like Gripen are going to be rather fresh. Some planes like F-16s, despite the fact that they're going to be refurbished, are still going to have rather old airframes. And then you got the Tornado and the Mirage 2000, where you don't know exactly what kind of status both of the planes that were going to be given will have at the time they will arrive there. And then there's the logistic aspect. You're gonna have 4 different planes plus the 3 different planes you had before. These 4 different planes that are gonna have are completely new to you. So your mechanics and so on are gonna be, in my opinion, manned by foreigners, contractors, volunteers, call it as you wish. And then you have the danger of getting a couple of Polish people completely vaporized, getting some Swedes vaporized, getting Dutch, German, Belgian, French, Americans in the territory of Ukraine vaporized. By seeing that, and given that people will have the obituaries fast enough and gonna see on the history of these guys, the danger is big that some of the potential killed people are going to be quote unquote recently discharged. And then is the backlash worth, I mean, politically, and in these countries, let's say that you got like a team of 20 Swedes going there for 6 Gripens, and unfortunately they got checked, and then an Iskander comes in, and out of the 20 Swedes, 10 are dead, and you lose 1 or 2 Gripens. What's going on then? How is the Swedish government going to explain this? I know already they're going to say, oh, they died for liberty and coward attack from Russia, and they were there as, volunteers. I completely get this. It's not like Russia has played the same bullshit monologue before. But, then war comes home for these countries, and then you have this feeling, and I'm not saying that they're going to tap out, quite the contrary. I'm feeling that by doing this, what's happening is trying to put that war thinking into all these countries populations heads, like, oh, see, they're not going to be like, why our people are there, we're not supposed to be at war, but they killed our people, we need to avenge them. And this slippery slope, in my opinion, far more than technical aspect and the way it's gonna go, it needs to be extremely checked, because I do not see the Russians, especially if it happens like that, that you have like 4 or 5 different types of planes being dropped, maybe some F-18s as well, into Ukraine. Is going to convince the Russians that it's not NATO fighting against Russia. So we're going to have both populations going at it and starting to be a lot more, you know, pushed towards confrontation, instead of considering with large part of Russian, you know, population, being still on the fence. Of course, they're gonna support their guys, but like if you ask why the war, they're not gonna be like, oh, the war is for this and that. Um, but once that starts, and you're gonna see these scenes, and you're gonna have the echo on the other side. The problem, especially when it comes to the Swedes. Although I mean you know that area better than me, but my idea is that I have this vision where instead of deterring these countries, instead of causing a real problem, the point is that this slippery slope is going to put both parties into a war path that supposedly, allegedly, both parties wanted to avoid. So, as you said, they're going to go full in. The escalation is not going to stop. And for the rest, I'm going to post some pictures of a Bogdana, the 8 Lancet. The damage is substantial, but it's just going to be a quick repair for the barrel. So, about 2 to 3 months and on the cabin. When it comes to the artillery war itself, unfortunately, the greatest so-called advantage is that the Ukrainians had from the Western artillery are not being seen, and most of it is due to, well, let's say it as it is, to the Lancet. That thing is a poison, and that thing just showed itself extremely resilient. We had the Avenger try to hit a Lancet on the dive. I don't know what happened after that because the Avenger missed it twice. But the most important part right now is that the technical battle is far from won for Ukraine, despite the influx from the West. I, as I said, I think that the first 6 to 12 barrels for the coalition are there. Those are probably going to be, if things don't work perfectly with coalition, are going to be mounted as 2A79 for the MSTS M2, which is going to give the Russians this long range that they mostly lack. That, as you said, they mostly are using either the Jatsint or the few M46s that we're using. So once again, I would like to say that there is no stagnation in this war when it comes to the threats that are being pressed forward. The only thing is, as you said yourself, and as we said multiple times, the only thing is that one side doesn't seem to adopt it massively until you get rained on by those UMPKs, that HIMARS. It doesn't matter which system it is on which side. It starts slow, but at some point they are everywhere. It was like this for the HIMARS. It was like that for the M777. Then Lancet came by. Then we started to have the UMPKs. Then both sides started to lob FPVs to each other, start to drone bomb each other with Mavics. Now Baba Yagas on the other side. We got the USVs on the Ukrainian side. And I agree with you. There could be something from Iran to help out the Russians. But once again, for the USVs themselves, the solution is pretty, you know, mundane. You just need a Overwatch ISR around your coast, because so far most of the most dangerous attacks were very close to the Crimean coast. So a Ukrainian jet is not going to fly there to swat out the Orions because it's going to get targeted itself. On top of it, once again, even Lancets can do that job. The problem is detection, and this is what is missing on the Russian side. It's and today apparently the commander of the Black Fleet got sacked. It's in this case, it's a lack of foresight on their part. I don't think it's a lack of means. I think that even fucking Moajer is gonna do the job. If it's just to do that, there is this feeling on the Russian side that sometimes they adapt this, as I said, this funnel, purpose, task, and action. Well, and sometimes it's not there. Like You could see perfectly the tunneling done in Avdiivka. The purpose was to breach the lines. Task at hand, exploit the tunnels, execution, and you had the result. But with um, these boats, it seems that the Russians are literally don't care whatever happens. And it's true they're low visibility. You cannot get them with radar right away, but you can get them with a passive surveillance. And one of the solutions, and I'm sorry to say it, guys, but it's what they always did, which is floating sonars. They can just start sowing sonars for 30, 50, 60 kilometers from the coast. This would create a huge problem for the entry of those boats within the Crimean coast. It would leave you between 25 and 35 minutes from detection once the barrier is breached to the coverage area within 60 kilometers. These are some things that Ukrainians are going to start thinking for. They're going to go for that, golden technological bullet. While the Russians were going to go far more with something that can do right away and think about a bigger solution. I think this is sometimes really needed. And on the Russian side, for sure, because there is no counter value. What the fuck are you going to hit? And as I said, the only possibility for the Russians is to go after the ships, is to go after, port equipment, tugboats, riverine boats, whatever. But this is not possible because the Russians are not thinking like that. What they think right now is that the Black Sea Fleet can get some hits, no problem. At some point, the Ukrainians are going to see how bad it's going on the front line instead of sending stupid ships to attack boats that finally are, do not have a direct impact on what's going on the front line. They're going to say, "Oh my God, we're losing. I don't know, Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, and so on. Let's stop doing this." But this is misunderstanding the Ukrainians or the part of the Ukrainian military that is doing these actions. The guys who are doing these actions, they don't care about the war. It's literally pieces of shit who are supposed to be Ukrainian intelligence, but the task right now is just to kill Russians.
Maybe the land power mentality.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But
We have Crimea. We have a lot of land. We can act from the land, but they keep losing ships, man. Even an old Me-24P with a rotary Gatling 12.7, in the
Yeah, but
nose.
I agree with you. But there are a lot of solutions. You can get a helicopter there, and have gun pods. Whatever. Yeah, the solutions are there. The problem here is really detection and actually going after this problem. And so far, whatever has been done was mostly electronic warfare. It had worked before, so probably they thought it's gonna always work. But the ships that have been attacked more recently, I don't see what electronic warfare was there. And on top of it, given they were, ganged by these smaller suicide boats, it didn't matter. The electronic systems are not a panacea for tanks, where they need to suppress a smaller, computational unit, let alone those that are like basically fast boats with explosives and a lot of electronics in it. So the biggest problem I'm seeing right now, and to tell you, is that it seems that the Russians, it's not that much they don't know what to do, but they are not, they're not acting on it because it is a bit what I said to a lot of mutuals in the group, that what you need against those boats is a bulletproof situation, because every time, even if you stop them 9 times but they pass a tenth, the consequences are catastrophic. So it's all in or go home. The problem with that is that at the same time, if you lose 1 out of 10, the expenditure, that the footprint they're going to start showing to get you, is going also to show on the map, so you can hit a blow at this production, at this guiding team and so on. Plus, as I said, there is a lack of planning and analysis of what's happening on those boats. They go maximum 85 kilometers per hour. So to depart from the Ukrainian coast, Odessa, whatever, and to get roughly in between Feodosia and you know the main port of the Black Sea Fleet, Sevastopol, you need 3 to 4 hours minimum to travel, even more, 5 hours. So in those 5 hours, that boat could perfectly be seen and detected. And the only way to avoid that is, as I said, to use the grain corridor into Sulina. Then a boat goes under, dragging them or carrying them, comes roughly around 100 kilometers from the Crimean coast, releases them by moving, and then goes away. There is no other way to do this, especially when they come that close, because this attack was between I think 3 and 6 kilometers from the coastline. So it's once again, this shows that there is someone guiding them, there is someone cueing them, but that unfortunately that's the proxy war the Russians chose. But to stop them, the task itself apparently either hasn't been given, or the Russians are right now unable to do something about it, or they are taking risk because they say, whatever, what are the chances? But this is extremely dangerous and ill thought when you know how much is there to look at them from above and from the coast. Because we can speak as much as we want, the Turkish Coast Guard and Turkish fleet remains a NATO member, so they're going to transmit data, even though Erdogan pretends to be, the best frenemy of Russia. Those guys do not have any problem doing that, especially as Cesar Kunikov was part of the Syrian complement. So for the Turks, is in a certain sense win-win, especially as we are seeing what's going on right now with the Syrian army using FPVs and other means of defeat against you know the Turkish minions. So overall, I agree with you, but overall, the solution is far more the Russians not being able to get their shit together, or a a different calculus, which would be even more callous and more disastrous, in my opinion, but would make sense to, as we said, that they are far more focused on the fact that, okay, we lost the ship, you lost the city. This is exactly what happened with the Moskva when the Moskva was shot to shit and sank. They lost Mariupol and they lost over 5 to 6 thousand people at once. So this logic, where one has strategic goals and is taking your land, where you have different goals that could be strategic but could also be purely tactical, because at the end, okay, you shot a Rapucha, but they're gonna put 3 4 civilian cargos, and that thing can do just the same, especially for what they need the Rapucha right now regarding Crimea. So once again, yeah, there is, in my opinion, incompetency. There is a weird and cynical way to look at this, but at the same time, there needs to be something done about it, and hopefully the new Black Sea Fleet commander is going to go back to at least something that, as you said, are more predictable, which is air patrol, quick reaction force, because each and every time the ships are attacked at night, which it's the perfect way to employ the UCAV.
If I
Yeah, go.
can, it's just, I don't know. Maybe they lost. Maybe those difficult 20 years they had uh, drizzled them. But they were used to be famous for the Bastion and area denial thing with Gorshkov.
Yeah, but
So they are even failing in that. I mean, okay, we've spoken many times about the bullshit of having all their capital ships in the famous Mediterranean. blockade, if we call it so. But they are failing in the bastion. I mean, if they consider now that sea their sea, and but things like you said, they came to fall down, but they didn't get it with the Moskva situation and the losing the Snake Island, which I think was the final nail in the coffin. And so I don't know what's happening there. I wanted to ask you about the bridges. I remember you talked even previously about that. You know, the Ukrainians basically they killed Kherson and Nikolaev with the Antonovsky bridge hit. You know, what if the Russians decide to do the same and just form a choke point up in Kiev? I don't know for Zaporozhye or Dnipro regions. You see it in the future happening.
Well, if they want to get Zaporozhye, they will have to do that anyway because it would be the easiest way to get the city under control. They are not too far from Zaporozhye. I mean, you can see on the map. Um, it's not a huge push from where they are. So they are roughly at Kamyanske. They should be at like 40, where Vasilivka, Kamyanske. Just not to say any bullshit because I rather not have. So they are from Zaporozhye at 26 kilometers. It's very reminiscent to the Nikolaev situation where they weren't far. They were very close. At some point, they were less than 10 kilometers. At some point, they were at the airport. They were extremely close to entering Nikolaev, but it never happened because they didn't commit the troops, and then the Ukrainians understood the ploy and then counterattacked almost immediately, risking a lot of their own very precious long-range fires, including two Bayraktar TB2s, which took part into coordinating the strikes against Kherson International Airport that caused a lot of damage. But in this case, I think for Zaporizhia, the time will come at some point because once again, they are not too far. They can, if the situation is right, of course, they can completely press all the small cities of Steptohirsk, Veselyanka, Balabin, and so on against the reservoir. The reservoir, as you know, is half dry now. So the threat would be the eventual threat from the Russians if they are completely crazy, but you never know with them, is a kind of operation around Bilenke and following up the reservoir line from Litorivka, Kanivka, and so on, and they end up at Rozumivka, which is at the other uh, bank of the Dnieper. By doing so, they attract Ukrainian fire, and then they start cutting the bridges around Zaporozhye, and they can advance then along. With the 20-kilometer gap that is between the bank that the Russians owe and sorry guys, and the other side. I just want to say check this to be sure. So they have 23 kilometers. So with the 23 kilometers differential at Kamyanske, the Ukrainians cannot start bringing the artillery close in. They will need absolutely to start firing with HIMARS and stuff like that to counter them. So the danger actually for the Ukrainians is that by failing the Zaporizhia counter last year, they actually showed every single problem that they have. If the Russians put uh, two main thrusts, one along the corridor and the other around Orkiv, then the bridge in Zaporozhye, the bridges in Zaporozhye, become an absolute must because then you can literally cut 80% of the city by blowing up three main bridges, the very modern bridge that they put on, and also you can create the perfect, I'd say, storm for the Ukrainians by making the dam at the Dnipro has completely untenable, and you don't even need to blow it up and let the rest of the water from the Dnipro go down, which would be absolutely destroying the two other districts, so the Dniprovsky district and the Borodinsky district. But it would allow the Russians to basically knock out the whole city without even needing to defend themselves from the north, because the Ukrainians will be too busy of evacuating all the surroundings of the river, and probably the main central island at Kortitsa is going to be mostly flooded. So once again, there are a lot of options for the Russians for the bridge. The Zaporizhia one for sure. The other one that I'm expecting them to do, it's not in Kiev, but it's going to be in Dnipro. In Dnipro, why? Because once again, by blowing one particular bridge in Dnipro, you add 50 to 20 kilometers within the city. By blowing a second bridge within Dnipro, you literally push them up over 60 kilometers to make a detour. And then unfortunately, they have a last bridge in Nova Posta, in Novoselivka, and that one is going to be the last nail to the Dnipro area, and then you have a detour of easily 120 kilometers. You need to go to Novomoskovsk to cross the small confluent to the Dnipro, that is Samara. So once again, there are options, and with very few targets, about six, the Russians can literally eliminate two main threats. First being a counter from Zaporozhye, and the other one is the logistical chain from Zaporozhye towards Dnipro, and then from Dnipro to Novomoskovsk. Then you pull the transfer over 100 kilometers, and then everything needs to go towards Pavlograd, which means that everything is more complicated. And instead of using the Zaporizhia axis or the Dnipro axis to go towards Pokrovsk and the usual Kramatorsk area, you end up with having to do a whole detour of over 180 kilometers by road. Train wise, it's just the same, 220 kilometers. So on a purely strategic side, if you are pushing there, it makes sense. If you are not pushing there, it doesn't make sense. Why? Because they are going to repair it. It's going to take time. But if you're not pushing for the Zaporizhia axis, like the Americans did with the Antonovsky Bridge, they were pushing in Kherson, it makes no sense. So, in my opinion, the logic would be when the Russians are ready, it should be a subsequent attack. So, you push from Kamensk towards Balatine, you blow up the bridge in Zaporozhye, and suddenly the guys need to cross by whatever you want, boats, pontoons, or have to go 100 kilometers to go back. And the funny part is, in order to go back to the other side of Zaporozhye, if you want to go from Dnipro, it's 70 onto Dnipro up and 70 back. So you have 140 kilometers just to cross the river. If you go to Novomoskovsk, you are at 200 kilometers just to bypass the river. So I do think that at some point an operation to take Zaporozhye will consider taking out the bridges, because it's the easiest way to do, and it will be a perfect reverse Uno to what happened in Kherson. But I think that instead of doing that, the Russians are going first to be sure about their bet in Donetsk, and then probably by the end of the year, if the situation on the Ukrainian side doesn't change, we're gonna have preparations for the front line to move from where it is actually. So it's basically on the Vasilivka or Kiev Pologi line towards you know Zaporozhye, Ternuvate, and then Starominiva, Grand Novosilka on that line. It could go beyond Pokrovske and then goes to Donetsk.
If
Only
I
what I'm
may,
seeing is, yeah, go on.
I was just thinking, for the deindustrialization thing of the special military operation that Putin has said, there are two very important enterprises there. It was Yangel OKB in Dnipro, I think.
Yeah, but it was treated very early in the war. I don't think they repaired it, but I think they moved it because we're speaking about its reestablishment in Lutsk. I'm not sure how true it is because now with the Ukrainians you can believe very little.
It
But
was huge and probably has been tunnelized since Soviet times because it was of big importance. R-36 and the SS-24 and whatever they built there, and another one, the Motor Sichban in Zaporozhye.
yeah, but that one, I mean, it's a gone deal. I mean, they bombed it 4 times. The only thing that could remain, as you said, it's either underground bunkers, but with limited use. Either what they were doing for a while, which was uh, displacing part of the Motor Stitch enterprise towards Lviv
Hmm.
to incorporate it to the Remont Zavod there for the MiG 29s. Has it been done? I'm not sure. The thing is, though, and this needs to be said, they don't seem to have big problems with their Mimil 7 fleet. So it means that at least some of use has been preserved for Remont. Now the other problem is if they had zero problems, they wouldn't go around the world getting spare parts. Notably, the last one from Ecuador. So that too, what to believe, But
I don't know if it's spare parts. They're just the frames because the frames cannot them make, but the remont, the how you say the repair.
yeah,
Their plans had all the capacity they needed because in the Cold War logic they were supposed, to help the Western group of armies. So that's why all the shit that was in Ukraine is never ended, basically. Or and
yeah.
the repair plans they had for the Su-24s or for the RD-33s of the MiG-29 that we've been talking previously is there. They can do that.
I think yes, they can. But what I think the real problem is that they are getting spares from the usual suspects. So a lot of the supposedly Slovak MiGs that were supposed to fly, remember there was this joke that only two were moved by truck and the rest flew into the country. I've seen very few of them. I think I saw three Slovak MiGs being still used, which means that most of them have been just became part donors, or they have been repainted, and then the Ukrainian planes were used as part donors. But in any case, I think there a modicum of repair. One of the things that I said is, for instance, uh, okay, not related with the planes, but with tanks. There was a crate with 130 from Kharkov or whatever subsidiaries still exist in Kharkov of gearboxes for T-64s and T-72s. That shows that despite the fact that the whole area of the tank from Kharkov is cratered, someone is working, be that in a shed, be that in underground. So it's very complicated to take out these kind of industries. The only way to do it is to make them, squeeze as much as they can long term and then let them rot. That's the point.
I get you. I see we have a Das Vivo here, which I don't know if is the same guy from Military Photos.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same. It's the same. So, guys, up to you if you want to intervene. Otherwise, yeah, I'm gonna call it a game. Once again, I would like to apologize for the very absurd format today. But Twitter is going to the gutter with a lot of troubles, technical problems, and sometimes it works very well. Sometimes especially in the recent weeks, I've had problems. So I would like to apologize for the quality of the space itself, and for the rest, thank you very much for being here. Um, I would really, you know, invite you to check the latest RAND Corporation paper. It is not as much because it's interesting because it's right or wrong. It's the worldview. You need to see what kind of worldview is there and how they see themselves. This is the most important part when it comes to, dealing with how some Americans project themselves post-war or in the future when it comes to this war right now. Uh, Thank you very much, guys, and see you the next time. Bye bye.